All right, now that we have the binding on the neck, we can go ahead and add the binding to the bottom. So I went ahead and made a lot more. I mean, I have so much that I'll have to cut some of it off at the end, but there is no reason not to have as much spare binding as you can afford in your little binding box. So I'm going to stitch this on again using my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm actually going to fold this down only probably about 3/8 of an inch so that I can have a slightly wider binding at the bottom. And I probably actually will only stitch this about 3/8 of an inch. I'll show you in just a sec. All right, because the purpose of this binding is to essentially finish the bottom edge in a nice extensible way, I am only going to use my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here. And so we'll just, and also I'm being careful to make sure that I don't stretch this too much and I don't stretch that too much, that I just allow them to really kind of be their natural selves. I did pin it, but in some cases I actually will put it on without even pinning it, just to make sure that I really just get this to be as loose as possible. And that's because this is along the bottom edge of the shirt. And when I sit down, or if you take a step, you want to make sure that the bottom opening can stretch as far as possible. On something like a t-shirt, we would just use stitches to fix the bottom edge, and on something like a pair of pants or a dress, we would just fold the edge up itself. But I have found that the contrasting binding is such a fun kind of secret surprise. Of course, this isn't contrasting here, but when we get to here, it will be contrasting. And so I found that to be such a fun secret surprise, and such a durable way to give that bottom edge kind of body, or sort of fullness that helps the shape of the bottom of the shirt to kind of be distinctive, that I think it's worth the bit of extra trouble to make and attach the binding. So, plus it's a chance to practice the binding in kind of a different setting. And one of the goals of my Oneshirt has always been to help people learn additional confidence in their sewing. So practicing doing a binding of this type can be really useful. When I get to the very end here, because I'm probably going to stop the video before that. It was hard to pull up because I was standing on this. When I get to the very end, I'll just stop right there, and then when we do the ironing phase, I'll show you how I clip that. But a quick note, I've made sure to definitely pin any place where I want the seam allowance to be butterfly to open, or to be laying in one direction or another. Right, I've pinned those down. I don't want to depend on, I want to make sure that they follow the ironing that I did previously. Alrighty, so now that I've gotten this binding stitched to the bottom edge, I can actually just press it flat in that direction. I am going to trim this off right here by just following the current edge. And then I have some spare to use maybe in the neckline or on sleeves for another shirt. And I'm going to go ahead and iron this all the way around. And if I really want to be extra, I could put a top stitching line right there. It actually would be called understitching because it's eventually folded under like this, and it's designed to keep this from pooching out. But given that I'm going to stitch it down like this, I don't always put the understitching in. Sometimes I do with contrasting sewing thread, because it adds, again, just like a secret extra pop of color down there and can make the shirt look really cool. All right, and so once I've got this ironed nicely in this direction, I'll then turn it over. And so if this was a binding that was wrapping around the edge, I'd fold it like this, right? And I have done that on occasion, right? Then that can be a cool look, again, with some kind of secret contrast. But in this case, I want it to sit like this, and I want it to have a bit of a fold here. And so I could buy binding that had all of these folds already ironed in. That is true. I even have like a little metal tool that I can run the binding through that folds it in the right fold so that you can iron it as you pull it out of the metal tool. Those are handy. But I have found that having the flexibility of not knowing ahead of time, do I want this to be a double fold binding or a single fold binding? Do I want it to be a 1/4 of an inch wide or 1/2 inch wide, right? If I just start with my 2-inch wide binding that's in my box of binding, then I can continue on with whatever I choose. All right, and so I've got this set here, and then I don't need to put the whole thing on the whole video, but then I'll come back and iron it just up like this. And that way I have got it ready. And in fact, I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll pin it in a few spots, especially in these places where things can catch, right? So I might, and you'll notice that the bottom is ever so slightly curved, and so that's why we used bias there. And so iron that in, and then definitely come back and pin it in these spots where we have the piece that could get caught as we're stitching by. And there in the center, right, where we have those little pieces there. And then right here, because I had gotten that far previously, right? And so I'll do all of that, but then actually, once I'm not going to pin it all the way around, because my very next step after I iron all of this, right, so I would have had this edge ironed there, is to stitch all the way up the front. And so I would carefully make sure that it matches there and there, right, and I would do that by pinning it right there, and then double checking that the pin was showing right next to the stitches. And then I would bring it all the way up to the top and do the same thing up here. So I would put the pin in here, my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I might need more of a seam allowance. Yep, I do, because I've got this, they've planned in my seam allowance for me. And so I'm actually going to put the pin coming from this side first. I'm not going to leave it there because I am going to sew from the bottom up. But this will tell me roughly where the pin needs to be, and good. And then I'm going to very carefully match these two seams here, again, using the side where I can see where my seam allowance needs to be, putting it in right where the stitches are, and double checking that it's coming out right where the stitches are. And then I'll go ahead and stitch that on either side, or pin it on either side. And then I'll go ahead and put in one more pin here just to guide me as far as making sure that I consistently stay this far over. And then I can go in and put at least one more pin down here in the seam allowance. And actually, if I'm being a good citizen, I'll get out my sewist, not a citizen. I'll get out my ruler and just double check. Okay, so that is 40 millimeters right there. And so I'll double check that these pins here are at least 40. And actually, I think it was 48 millimeters. Because in this case, this has this sort of fuzzy edge, and I stitched to the fuzzy edge, right? So yeah, at least 48 millimeters down. So I'm going to put a couple of pins so that when I start this way down here at the bottom, I start it at the right distance. So normally I would just use my own seam allowance, but in this case, because of the printing that I want to hide, right, I'm going to use their seam allowance. And of course, if it were you, I would recommend starting at the top here so that you can see it the whole time.